So is anybody else getting a kind of cry for help vibe from the YouTuber Whatifalthist? At some point over the past month, my two previous critiques of this young purveyor of doom made it past 100,000 views. That means I owe you a new video on Whatifalthist, so I started watching his channel again, looking for something new to say, and I've gotta say, his recent production is pretty bleak.
I've stopped going to major cities anymore since the vibes are just too bad. It feels like nails on a chalkboard. Everyone's depressed, everything's deteriorating, the air feels like tar. This might make me sound crazy, but when I look at the TV today, something's off. People look like puppets. They don't move their eyes enough, their neck posture isn't right, they don't move their arms enough. It's like the spark is gone.
Now, maybe I'm projecting a little bit here. I'm honestly kind of depressed right now myself. I see my job as cheerfully documenting the expansion and consolidation of U.S. empire. It's a lot harder to do that happily when I see my government and my tax dollars providing diplomatic cover, free weapons, and logistical support to what most people in the world recognize as a genocide. It's getting hard for me to do my job. Perhaps Whatifalthist is having similar difficulties with what we're doing to Palestine.
For some reason, the Israel war is driving people really crazy. I'm not sure why, we're not involved, and as an Anglo-American, I'm not sure what this war means to me.
Okay, so maybe Whatifalthist isn't particularly well connected to that piece of reality, but he can't be missing how depressing it is that the 2024 U.S. presidential election has devolved into a rerun battle of geriatrics. A certain amount of weariness is to be expected from political commentators in 2024. But Whatifalthist's analysis goes beyond depression to straight-up yearning for apocalypse.
The point where I see the general zeitgeist is they just can't bear it anymore. We're getting to the point where a large part of the population needs a civil war so they don't kill themselves.
Yikes. As a quick review, Whatifalthist is the nom de YouTube of Rudyard Lynch, a 22-year-old history buff who has built an impressively large platform over the past decade. I make these critiques of him primarily because they get views, but also because I am really jealous of the size of Mr. Lynch's audience. Whatifalthist started off with alternate history videos, but in recent years, perhaps radicalized by his viewers, his content has become more and more right-wing. Despite being barely out of his teens, he has adopted the personality of a world-weary, get-off-my-lawn curmudgeon. It's kind of ridiculous, but it's been working for him. In past videos, I've pointed out that while young Mr. Lynch is clearly a very smart kid, he's been betrayed by his reading list. He appears to mostly focus on grand right-wing theories of history instead of the boring details of what actually happened and what's happening now. He is perceptive enough to see that there are a number of things that are very wrong with the United States and the world, but his Fox News for Nerds ideology keeps him from seeing any possible solutions to these problems. As I've pointed out before, I have a lot of sympathy for Whatifalthist because 20 years ago, I was just like him. I was young, frustrated professionally, and filled with right-wing fantasies of violence. I could see that the world had serious problems, but the anti-government Republican ideology I still believed in offered no solutions other than tax cuts and murdering Iraqis. I fervently believed that no better world was possible. That was a really shitty place for me to be in mentally. And I can't imagine how much worse it must be for Whatifalthist with a audience of hundreds of thousands of people who show up expecting him to regurgitate these same tired anti-social justice warrior takes that were honestly pretty played out back in 2020.
We're getting to the point where a large part of the population needs a civil war so they don't kill themselves.
I still believe that Lynch will snap out of it one day and start posting sensible stuff, but that is not what has happened in the 2 years since I last checked in with him. Instead, he's just gotten more extreme. He's now openly predicting, and just short of calling for, civil war in the United States. Before we dissect that argument, there's a telling clip from another video I want to mention.
I love this painting. The way it works is that some people see an old lady, others see a young woman. My goal for Whatifalthist is to let people who are looking at this painting see both images at the same time and explain which one of these interpretations I believe to be the most correct.
This seems like a sensible, fair-minded thing to say, but it's not a painting. It's a cartoon, a drawing, or perhaps an etching published in a British magazine over a century ago. This may seem like a minor point to harp on, but it's emblematic of so much of Whatifalthist's video production. He'll make a big show of being fair-minded or open-minded, and then in the next sentence he will assert some wrong opinion, usually a right-wing opinion, as if it's incontrovertible truth that nobody could disagree with. It gets really frustrating after a while. So let's take a look at this Why the 2024 Election Will Start a Civil War video, published on February 8th, 2024. I already feel like I need to apologize to Whatifalthist a little bit. I prefer to talk about arguments, not armchair psychoanalysis. Making assumptions about the mindset of your political opponent is really the lowest form of discussion there is. The problem is that in this entire 38-minute video, there's nothing concrete enough to critique. There are no arguments. There's nothing here. There's no prediction. There's no description of how an election between two candidates that very few actually like is supposed to morph into a civil war. There's some numerology, a carefully selected list of different types of wars, ignoring many other important wars, meant to imply that the English-speaking world is due for a civil war somehow, because math. There's the trotting out of the Peter Turchin, George Friedman, Strauss and Howe cycles bullshit. That stuff is fun to think about, but it's honestly about as serious as Nostradamus. The kind of science fiction that is produced by these writers can teach us a lot, or can at least provide fuel for interesting thought experiments, but if you're using it to derive concrete predictions for dates of things, you've completely lost the plot. The Civil War video is mostly vibes and fantasy, specifically about a mythical, poorly described right and left. The right is everything that's heroic and manly, while the left is everything that's bad and female. Whatifalthist concedes that right-leaning people are vastly more likely to get violent, but he believes it would still be the left wing's fault because, well, I'll let him describe it himself.
The left's psychology is female and the right's is male. Women will do low-level aggression much more than men. They lie more, spread more rumors, insult more in non-violent action. I think the left is trying to agitate the right so much so that the right has to do something crazy so that the left can get a consensus that the right is dangerous. It's effectively a wife begging her husband to beat her again and again so that when he actually does do so, she can take him to court as an abuser. The sad thing is that in our society, she can just say that he beat her without any evidence and the court will believe it. I know a couple of people that happened to.
I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to what that passage means about Whatifalthist's attitudes towards women and the quality of people he's been surrounding himself with. These fantasies of right and left inform what little he has to tell us about his longed-for civil war and what it might look like.
I want to be clear that I'm not sure what type of conflict this will be. I do think the right would win given it gives the best incentives to young men who fight wars while the left hates them.
So conservatives provide better incentives to warfighters, do they? I suppose Lynch can be forgiven for not remembering the George W. Bush years very well. But I don't recall our soldiers much enjoying the meat grinder the neocons put them through. The Bushies did a lot of shady stuff, like stop-loss and entrapping the National Guard to feed their war machine. Though I suppose it is nice that President Bush has spent his retirement painting pictures of all the U.S. soldiers he needlessly dismembered. Very little that Whatifalthist says about left or right has much to do with reality. And the video gets pretty dark.
We all need to be very careful over the next year. For normal people, keep your eyes open for when these decisive shifts might happen. If you're a blue person in Texas or a red person in California, try to figure out when a good time would be to get out for your own safety. Lots of death happens in civil wars, and people hate the other side. Think of all the Jews in Poland in 1939 who considered fleeing.
I'm sorry, but this is insane, and it's one of the main problems with all U.S. Civil War fantasies, whether they happen to be Whatifalthists or Hollywoods. Despite the hype, the United States just isn't that divided, and the differences we have are not straightforwardly geographical. In even the most polarized red and blue states we have, places like Democratic Vermont or Republican Mississippi, at least 30% of the population votes in the other direction. In bigger states like New York or Texas, the numbers rarely skew further than 60-40. Even Whatifalthist's own data doesn't support the hype on cultural division. He quickly flashes this chart on fertility to illustrate the divide.
The young people in the left belong to what is a suicide cult.
But if you pause the video and look at the numbers, you see that pretty much every state, red and blue, has a birth rate between 1.5 and 2 kids per woman. The only outlier is South Dakota in the middle there, which has a higher birth rate because of its disproportionately higher indigenous population. I don't want to make any unfair assumptions here, but I have a hunch that Native Americans are not what Whatifalthist is thinking of when he talks about Western civilization preserving conservative families. Lynch doesn't talk seriously about any of the real divisions in the United States, which are mostly about money. They're about wealth, not this Fox News cartoon of who really runs the country, this country subjected to leftist control. As you listen to this next passage, just think to yourself, does anything here describe a real living human being? Does any of it describe a coherent ideology that anyone could pick up arms in a civil war to fight for or against?
Some older people might not believe me here when I say the left is openly suicidal, but to just go through the list, the modern left wants to degrow the economy, they view having children as immoral, they are bringing in millions of immigrants to commit what they openly say is effectively civilizational suicide, they are printing the most money of any period ever in Western history, they are tearing down the statues of their great leaders of the past, blackening their nation's greatest accomplishments. They say they want to destroy their societies.
So did the tiny fraction of people who are against economic growth or reproduction run our immigration policy? Are the people responsible for too much money printing running around tearing down statues? Is anybody tearing down statues anymore in 2024? Whatifalthist's descriptions of U.S. politics are all caricature, and it's not even particularly current caricature. The Democrats are currently pushing a restrictive new immigration law that the Republicans are vetoing because they don't want to lose immigration as an issue in the election. I know Whatifalthist and his supporters hate this particular critique, but as smart as he is, he's just too young, and he has no perspective on politics or the country. Everything he's experiencing is fresh and new and feels revolutionary, so he believes it's all fresh and new, even though very little of it is. We had much better organized and scarier right-wing militias back in the 1990s, as just one example. Here's another good example.
NEET stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. NEETs would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. I didn't think they were real even 3 years ago.
So NEETs were unimaginable in 2019, huh? Maybe for Whatifalthist. For those of us in reality, it was a bit different. Here's a Pew Research Center report from 2016 talking about 10 million NEETs. They found it to be a troubling number, but we're happy that it was down significantly from 2008 highs 16 years ago. Mr. Lynch is just as deluded about the right wing as he is about the left. His vision of a heavily armed network of young right-wing men who are just itching for the chance to form a new confederacy is a fantasy he shares with the currently Democrat-leaning national security state. The FBI has been looking desperately for these guys for years now. The deep state needs a new gravy train now that our Saudi allies aren't funding as much Islamic terrorism. The problem is that these neo-Confederate militias simply don't exist. The few examples we have were actually created by the FBI. Remember that plot to kidnap Michigan's Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer? It was revealed to great fanfare in October 2020 as an example of the sorts of Donald Trump-inspired violence we should be looking out for. It turns out that, like almost every other example of domestic terrorism since 2001, the dumbasses who managed to get convicted were lured into their crimes by overactive FBI informants. No matter how badly Whatifalthist and the FBI want there to be a vast right-wing conspiracy, it just doesn't exist. Now, I'm not saying that there will be no violence around the 2024 election. I've honestly been surprised at how little political violence there's been over the past 4 years, and I kind of expect a few more horrific events. But the overarmed incels that Whatifalthist talks about aren't really the types to put together elaborate kidnap plots or take territory from the federal government. They're more the types to shoot up high schools, synagogues, and mosques. One more stray thought on this topic. Why do right-leaning people assume that the density of private guns in their territory would be somehow good for their side? That's not how civil wars work, as Whatifalthist points out.
What will happen is that intelligent, well-organized, and fanatical political types inside Gen Z will organize and then conscript the weak. The weak won't organize and so won't have any leverage at all. In almost all revolutions or civil wars, most normal people want to just be left alone, but they don't do anything or organize, so small groups of radicals dominate politics and conscript the normies.
So how is this mass conscription of the weak in right-wing territories supposed to work out when every other household has a private arsenal to draw on? Assuming a million insane things happen and we're in a position to have a civil war, all those private AR-15s are going to be used to shoot the right-wing wannabe generals coming to conscript your sons. Imagine Yemen on steroids. That clip comes from one of the only coherent and logical portions of the video. Whatifalthist rightly points out that the vast majority of people in the United States have zero interest in a civil war. But he points out that that was also true of revolutionary Russia, revolutionary France, and many other conflicts across history.
It's normal in civil wars or revolutions for the most radical factions, which are only indicative of a tiny percentage of the population, to win, since they're the best organized and fanatical.
But we're not in 1700s France or early 1900s Russia. Those were societies where 1% or less really benefited and 90% plus just suffered. That is not the United States today. We're not living in the left-led dystopia that Whatifalthist describes. But we're also not living in a 1%, 99% society the way some left-leaning people describe either. What it really is more of a 20% versus the 80% society. 20% are living a pretty miraculous life thanks to the globalized marketplace we've built over the past 40 years. And probably another 20% thinks they have a chance to get into that privileged class. Leftists and Whatifalthists are very correct that Reaganism has left more than half of the country behind. But from a Civil War perspective, that doesn't matter. Revolutions can kind of work, and small factions of radicals can take control in a 99% versus the 1% situation. In a country like the United States, where 20 to 40% love the status quo, revolution is just never happening. 65% of the US population already owns one of those homes that Gen Z will supposedly never be able to afford. Apologies to both the radical left and the radical right, but the United States today simply has too many stakeholders for it to be overthrown by a cathartic revolutionary war. Whatifalthist isn't alone in his fantasies about the 2024 election. The entire Democratic Party establishment is ramping up the fall of democracy porn in an effort to cover up its complicity in genocide. I don't buy any of it, whether it comes from Whatifalthist or the Atlantic Monthly. I'm still pretty sure that Joe Biden is going to win this election. Most polls are measuring Biden against anybody else. I expect his statistics will improve once Trump becomes the clear opponent. And even if it's close, people are forgetting why the 2020 election was such a mess. It was a problem because Donald Trump was president. He had a lot of levers to pull to try to hang on to power. If he loses in 2024, he absolutely will dispute the election. Maybe he'll even persuade some of his clowns to shoot up a polling place or two. But he won't be president. He'll be a private citizen. So it will all blow over pretty quickly. There's also the other possibility to consider. What if Trump wins and the Democrats try to steal the election? What if Biden drools on himself during the debate or has a stroke or something? Will the Democrats really steal the election for Kamala Harris? I kind of doubt it, because the sad fact is that most large Democratic donors would be just as happy, or maybe even happier, with a President Trump than with a President Biden. Sure, Trump is gross, but that top 20% loves a tax cut. And if Biden wins in 2024, Trump's 2017 tax cut will probably just expire. The truth is that the rich win either way in 2024. Either they get the less embarrassing guy, who'll probably be better for business in some respects, or they get to keep their 2017 tax cuts and, put up with Trump, who'll probably give them more tax cuts. Why would they bother stealing an election or risking starting a war over stakes like that? As unstable and cringe-inducing as Whatifalthist's Civil War video is, it's actually quite mainstream. Fostering division and getting everybody to freak out about polarization is one of the main strategies that people who benefit from the current system are using to keep us from making the, honestly, fairly easy changes that we could make in US politics to improve things dramatically. As I've emphasized in other videos, including this Whatifalthist series, the country is waking up to the 40-year theft we've been subjected to. People from both parties are getting sick of the corporate abuses and monopolies that are making 80% of the United States poorer. The main thing that the monopolies have to protect themselves with is the kind of brain-dead polarization that Whatifalthist is pushing in most of his videos. If we are angry at each other over minor issues, we will have less time to go after the people who are truly profiting off of our misery. Woke, anti-woke, more serious issues over guns and abortion are the distractions that are keeping decent handfuls of Democrats and Republicans from tackling the country's real problems. Sadly, Whatifalthist has decided so far to continue being part of the problem rather than being part of the solution. His analysis of foreign policy is also nuts. This video may be getting a little long, but I can't help but draw out a few insane quotes from his video on a possible U.S. war with Iran from January 19th, 2024. Because U.S. foreign policy is insane, Whatifalthist's worst statements from this video are also very, very mainstream. I've been pointing out for a few months now the fact that Washington, D.C.'s favorite president is George W. Bush. Beltway insiders may pretend to condemn him, but that's the foreign policy and the level of U.S. intervention they want to get back to. Sadly, this seems to be true of Whatifalthist as well.
15 years ago, the US had basically surrounded Iran. If we wanted to invade, it would be a lot easier back then. We had field armies of tens of thousands of men in Iraq and Afghanistan. Turkey was still a strong ally, and Pakistan was still a decent ally. If we were to invade Iran in 2005, we could have launched a four-pronged strike surrounding the country, forcing it to fight a four-front war. At that point, we could have launched attacks from Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, and the Gulf of Hormuz at the same time. They wouldn't be able to withstand this, and their industrial base would fall apart as their men gave up. We would have won easily.
Again, I don't suppose Lynch can be expected to remember world events from when he was a toddler, but the United States did not look like a successful Middle East hegemon in 2005. We were losing badly to an insurgency in Iraq, and DC's dreams of invading Iran were on an indefinite hold. By the way, this insane period of waste and destruction is the source of around a fifth of the national debt that Whatifalthist usually likes to complain about. Lynch's reference to Turkey is particularly ignorant. Turkey, circa 2005, was absolutely not going to allow the United States to use its territory to invade Iran. We can say this with great confidence because in 2003, Turkey vetoed the Bush administration's attempt to use Turkish territory to invade Iraq. Whatifalthist's coverage of the Bush administration is delusionally positive, which is a very typical Washington, D.C. attitude to take.
The Trump administration, although you may criticize it for a bunch of things, had what I believe to be the best foreign policy of any American president since the Cold War.
This list of Donald Trump's foreign policy accomplishments is a little less D.C.-friendly, but it's just as ignorant. Let's do a speed round. Started the fight against China? Nope. That was, for better and mostly for worse, Obama. Google Myanmar 2011, Japan rearmament 2015, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump may have talked more shit, but Obama and Biden both took many more concrete anti-China actions. This myth is taking hold because the rich people that own all the cable channels want Trump back in power, and they want to give him credit for something. Number 2, courting alliances with the Saudis and the Turks is a weird way to say taking personal bribes. Also a deeply meaningless point. Both countries are wholly dependent on the United States. Trump was more subservient to these client states than Biden is, but that's more embarrassing than anything else. Trump could and should have made Turkey happier by withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, but he never did that, despite claiming to on at least 3 occasions. Trump took us out of trade deals? Name one. He renegotiated NAFTA, and he stopped the TPP, but that is an agreement that hadn't been ratified yet. He changed the status quo very little. Forcing the Europeans to rearm for defense? Nope, never happened. Trump talked a lot, but even in 2024, with war in Europe, NATO countries are still way behind on their defense commitments. De-emphasizing the Middle Eastern strategy? Oh, you mean by tearing up our peace treaty with Iran and killing one of their major generals? Trump's harebrained Abraham Accords are also one of the main reasons we got that horrific October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. Not starting a war? This one is kind of true and important, but Trump destabilized everything from Ukraine to Israel, making Biden's wars much more likely. Whatifalthist gets partial points for this one. Cutting off immigration leading to wage increases? Deeply, deeply debatable. The main reason unemployment went down is because of all the government money the Republicans in Congress let Trump spend. It's unclear whether or not immigration had anything to do with it. Number 8 is probably my favorite item on this list. Reindustrialization, which has taken off since. By taken off since, he means during the Biden administration. Trump talked a lot, but it's Biden that actually passed the relevant infrastructure legislation. Unifying Europe against China and the Russians. Okay, then yeah, why did Europe celebrate the end of the Trump administration by signing a comprehensive agreement on investment with China? It's Biden that has kept that agreement from being fully ratified, not Trump. Number 10, turning Russia against China? How exactly? By arming Ukraine and sanctioning China for buying Russian weapons, driving the two countries closer together? This list is absolutely delusional. I found this list so infuriating that I went ahead and recorded a whole podcast episode talking just about this list and the ludicrous idea that Donald Trump's foreign policy was successful. That episode of my podcast should be coming out in the first couple weeks of April. You can find the More Freedom Foundation podcast on Spotify, Apple, and a range of other platforms. I hope you'll check it out. I could go on like this for hours, but I won't bore you with it. Whatifalthist's foreign policy takes are even worse than his domestic policy takes, and they are both getting worse. He's not reflecting reality. He's doing partisan hackery that gets more diluted with every video. Why is the content produced by this very smart kid devolving further and further? Well, I've got a theory. Without really meaning to, I preserved a record of how Whatifalthist's videos were doing 2 years ago. If you compare those numbers to how his recent videos are doing today, you can see a clear pattern of decline. He's still getting hundreds of thousands of views, numbers I would be incredibly grateful for. But I know how terrible it feels when a channel stops growing, and it feels like things start going into reverse. Put simply, I think Whatifalthist is getting desperate. His numbers are going down, or at least not growing, so he's trying to recapture that old magic by doubling down on extremism, and he's traveling further and further away from reality with every video. It's honestly pretty sad to watch. I think this is probably my last Whatifalthist video. It's definitely my last video on this version of Whatifalthist. There's really not much more to say. Though I still believe he could change for the better.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up, either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.